I took a photo with every mainline pixel ever released. From 2016 all the way to present day, I have all the models here. So what's changed in the camera quality over the past 8 years? Boy, we're about to find out. Hey guys, I'm Ryan Thomas, and the phones I have here are all the XL or the Pro models where applicable, and all phones are on the latest public software available for each device. So no betas, no custom ROMs, no forced side-loaded software here. These cameras are as good as Google has tuned them to be. So actually quite an improvement from when they first came out. A lot of these updates actually improve the camera performance on the devices over their lifespan. But before we get into the samples, it's actually important and quite interesting to see the changes in hardware over the years. Of course, the newer phones have more sensors and lenses than ever before, but we're going to be focusing primarily on the main camera, as that's directly comparable across the range, where we couldn't exactly shoot ultra-wide on the first 4 pixels. See, as it turns out, Google loves to reuse camera sensors in its smartphones. The first 5 generations shared pretty much the same sensor. The first Pixel lacked OIS, which gained a small size bump compared to the rest of the devices in the smaller line. But from a functional standpoint, this is 5 generations of smartphone with the same small Sony IMX main camera on the back. And when the Tensor era came in, from the 6 all the way to the 8, there was a leap in sensor size, significantly bigger with the GN1. Not only did it gain physical size, but also quadruple the resolution, and Google has used it in all 3 generations of Tensor Pixel thus far. And on the software side, while the Tensor era all run Android 14, every generation of pre-Tensor era runs a different OS, and so theoretically we should see similar performance on the latest 3, but differing performance on the previous 5. There is also the caveat that in every phone on this list has a different SoC, with varying ISPs or image signal processors, so from a processing side it should be quite interesting. I want you all to get involved in the comments, ranking each of the 10 rounds on which pixel you think took the most pleasing and maybe the least pleasing shot. See which one shocked you the most. It'll be interesting to see how us Android fans are seeing the images a little bit differently. Let's kick things off with this flower that I have here. So what I'm going to do is slowly go through all of the different pixels straight away so you can see a general progression of the image quality. The first thing I want to point out is that the first 3 images, Pixel 1, Pixel 2 and Pixel 3, have quite a lot of magenta in them, and when we switch over to the Pixel 4 this largely goes away. If I switch back to the Pixel 3 again, you can see the magenta in the image, so there's clearly some colour changes after the Pixel 3 XL. You'll also notice that when I switch from the 5th to the 6th, so switching over to that larger sensor, that we actually get softer elements on the corners and around the edges, as this larger sensor gives a shallower depth of field, so you end up with fewer bits of the image in focus and that deeper separation between the subject and the background. There's the Pixel 6, there's the smaller sensored Pixel 5, and you can see there's more in focus. Switching things up to quite a difficult scenario now, I'm just going to go through the pixels very slowly so you can take a second, pause the video if you need to, and really see the details in each of these. But immediately you'll notice that this cloud in the background is quite blown out, and what we're looking at really is the detail in the red leaf here, but we also have the detail in the bush over to the left. The first thing I notice is that despite the smaller sensors in these earlier pixels, there's actually not a lot of HDR blooming going on, which is essentially where you would see sort of a highlighted outline around effects that needed to be brought down or brought up in Google's processing pipeline. Strangely, if I switch to the Pixel 2, you'll see there's a little bit more green in the sky compared to all of the other ones. I'm not sure why this is. Pixel 1 all the way through to Pixel 4, you're just getting slowly more detail in the leaves. Pixel 5 comes in, Pixel 6 comes in, and you're getting almost all the detail in the leaves but also in the sky as well. And then if we switch to Pixel 8, there's actually a substantial sharpness increase with the Pixel 8, with just how much detail you're seeing in the leaf here, despite the fact that we have a really bright background behind it. This is a picture of some paintbrushes. This is not portrait mode, this is just regular standard camera mode. If I go through these, you'll notice that actually going through them, say if we switch from the 5th, which is the last one to have the small sensor, to the Pixel 6, there's immediately more blur in the background just due to having that larger sensor. And the Pixel 1 compared to the rest of them is particularly dark. You'll notice that it has a slight colour shift as well, but it's just not picking up all of the detail in the background, which to be fair is a set of different levels of exposure. and then going all the way to the Pixel 8, you'll notice that it just has the most natural fall off in focus, and also just seems to be the most pleasing in that it's not cranking up the sharpness across the entire scene. This is a big test of dynamic range across all of the pixels with a very backlit sunny day here. The Pixel 1 has the worst dynamic range by a substantial margin, so look at the detail in the stack here and then look at just how blown out the sea is, the reflection of the sun. And if I switch to the Pixel 2, which is only one generation newer, wow, this is not even as blown out, and you still get way more detail in the bushes and also in the buildings. And then if I zoom into the rock here where you can see detail, actually if we go down to the Pixel 5, it gets an improvement over the smaller sensors over the generations. If I switch from the 5th to the 6th, there's seemingly a big jump in sharpness, and actually the 8th there has a nice natural sharpness, so you still get all the detail, but it doesn't look cranked up in digital sharpening, and the rest of the image just looks the most pleasing. So in this backlit doorway, again another big dynamic range test, you can see that actually the first one is really struggling with this blown out sky, although to be fair, for a phone as old as it is, it does a pretty good job. The second seems to blow it out even further despite not changing a massive amount of exposure in the foreground. The 3 and the first look very similar. The 4th and the 5th actually look almost identical. If I didn't have these labels in the corner, you might actually think that this was the same phone taking these photos. The 5th to the 6th doesn't see a massive change in dynamic range or detail, but then the 7th and the 8th actually have a much nicer highlight roll-off, and the image just looks way more pleasing and less artifacty or less artificial. This is a really difficult nighttime scenario where we're out looking at a harbour that sure has a light on beneath me here, but that overall is extremely dark, and none of the pixels seem to deal very well with this noise, even the latest version. This is all shot with the night sight deliberately on every single phone. The first and the second are really soft, although there is a big change in exposure. And then I found that the 3rd to the 7th was a little bit better. So you'll see that despite different OSs and different sensor sizes, they do improve. And then the 7th to the 8th, there's just a lot more sharpness going on in the Pixel 8 Pro in this rock here. If I go to the 7th and the 6th, they kind of get progressively softer and then sharpest with the Pixel 8 Pro. So there's definitely a big improvement on the Pixel 8 Pro. Here's another night shot, one that's a little bit brighter with the lights going on in the harbour itself. And as you can see, there is quite a jump in quality from the 1st to the 8th. The first one in particular just does not look very good. It's mushy, there's a lot of noise, nothing really seems to be in focus, and trust me, I got a couple of shots, this was the sharpest one. The second one, despite having very similar specifications, is a grand improvement. I mean, the difference in quality from the Pixel XL to the Pixel 2 XL is almost night and day. You would take this image just from a pretty standard phone in 2024, let alone one from all the way back in 2017. Although you'll notice that in the windows and in the lights, they're all really blown out. So whilst there's a fair amount of detail in the darker areas, there's not heaps of dynamic range. There's also a big jump in sharpness and detail when I go from the Pixel 5, which again is the last phone with that small sensor, to the Pixel 6 Pro, where just the text in the house, the text down here, it's all a lot sharper. I mean, that almost looks like daylight levels of sharpness in the sign on the boat, but we're still getting these really blown out highlights, which to be fair kind of add a little bit of ambience to the whole scene. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's clearly from a technical point of view not as good as the Pixel 8, which as you can see, you can actually start to make out the details inside this building while still getting quite a lot of detail everywhere else in the scene. So from the Pixel 6 to the 7th and then to the 8th, there is actually a grand improvement. It's showing that the Pixel 8 overall in nighttime photography is actually considerably better than the phones it replaced. Okay, this is portrait mode, or what the Pixel 1 calls lens blur, because there was no portrait mode back then for this phone. And as you'll see immediately, the Pixel XL with its lens blur is just very blown out in the highlights, and the cutout, to be fair, isn't that bad, but it is struggling with this part of my head blurring into the background. Funnily enough, the Pixel 2 XL and then the Pixel 3 XL really struggle with the cutout of my t-shirt, with the Pixel 1 not actually having the same kind of problem. Though I will say that the dynamic range on those 2XL and 3XL photos is quite a bit better, and there's a more natural fall off. The Pixel 4 XL does a tremendous job of cutting me out here, even with my hair, probably the cleanest cutout of them all, and the Pixel 5 also does a pretty decent job, a little bit of softness here, but overall a very impressive cutout. As you can see, there's quite a bit of a different colour shift going from the 4 to the 5. The bigger sensor cameras aren't exactly perfect with their cutouts, but there is a good amount of dynamic range, and actually you'll see that the detail across the whole scene just looks way better with these bigger sensors. There's just a significant increase in overall detail across the scene, and I think it looks the most natural, but let me know in the comments. Okay, this is an artificial and deliberately kind of tricky portrait mode or lens blur if you're the Pixel 1 XL, and as you'll see immediately, we have this Pixel 6 Pro box in the background, the black one, is going to cause trouble for almost all the phones. This one is a particularly difficult cutout because you've got the dark background but with these white areas, which makes it difficult for the phone to actually work out what to focus on. And then you've also got these little spines of the plant, which obviously are loads of little details to cut out. So the Pixel 1 is not looking great. The Pixel 2 actually greatly improves this, although you'll see the Pixel 6 Pro box in the background a little bit struggling, but not too bad, and the edges of these spines on the left aren't great either. Actually, the second all the way to the fifth do a pretty similar job, I would say, although that box still proving tricky. Surprisingly, the 6 does struggle quite a lot more than even the Pixel 5, I would say, in this instance. And then the Pixel 7 and then the Pixel 8 improve on things again. This is one that almost any phone is going to struggle with, but I'd say the Pixel 8 Pro does a pretty decent job, all things considered. So you can see a big progression in artificial portrait cutouts. And then finally, this long shot really testing the detail. The Pixel XL doesn't actually zoom in as far as the others. These are about 7x, the Pixel 2, 3, 4 and 5, about 7x. And then I've also tried to compensate the 7x all the way through the line. With the Pixel XL, this is as far as it stretches, and as you can see, you probably know this is a set of PS2 games, but that's as far as it goes. And if I switch to the Pixel 2 XL, it is much more zoomed in for the rest of these. You could probably guess the text if you knew what PS2 games generally were. The Pixel 3 actually improves this quite substantially, so you can actually start to make out the different game names, which is really impressive despite the same sensor. The Pixel 4 XL has that 2x dedicated zoom, and so you can really easily make out all the names of the games. And then when we switch to the Pixel 5, of course it loses that telephoto, proving that that 4XL's telephoto lens, which some people called useless back in the day, is actually very useful. Switching to the 6 Pro actually gets quite grainy, but again, the text coming out in the games, not a problem. The 7 improves on this, flattening all of that grain and actually looking really clean, and you can sort of start to make out the game codes on the bottom. And if we switch over to the Pixel 8 Pro, wow, that's a big sharpness improvement, and we can actually work out a lot of the game codes. Go back to the 7, a little bit blurry. The 8 Pro really does a phenomenal job with its long range shooter. So what can we take from all this? Well, that the results as a whole can be broken down quite easily into 3 main categories. The first Pixel that struggled in a lot of these scenarios, the second through the 5th that evolved on this and largely performed the same actually in sharpness, dynamic range, colour reproduction accuracy and noise reduction across the same main sensor, and then the 6th through the 8th that switched to the GM1, which all performed very similarly too. The major caveat here is the 4th that seemingly performed better than the cheaper 5th, especially at long range, where the 2x dedicated telephoto really did make a difference when pinching in and getting more detail. And the 8 Pro's telephoto was clearly superior to the phone prior, despite having on paper very similar specifications. Who would have thought that when you use a better sensor, you get better results? I'm actually kind of surprised that despite the first 5 phones running different OSs, the camera results were pretty similar from the 2nd to the 5th. And then also actually the difference between the 6th and the 8th, despite ironically running the same hardware and software on the main camera, there was a bigger variance than I really thought there would be. When you compare the first Pixel to the last, there's clearly been some impressive progression, but it's been a couple of years since we've seen a huge leap in camera performance like we saw from the 5th to the 6th. So let's see what the company has up its sleeve for this year's phones. Which phone of the lot surprised you? Or did the fact they were all as close as they were shock you in any way? And which is your favourite Pixel generation, by the way? Mine has to be the second. I've done a video on this, perhaps coming soon, but I loved the jump in image quality when Google's own Tensor phones came out in the 6th gen. Anyway, while you're down there, do let me know in the comments what you think. Please hit like if you enjoyed today's content and subscribe if you're new around here to never miss another upload. I've been Ryan Thomas, and I'll catch you later. Cheers.